Hello, Jen here. As you may or may not be aware, on the 30th of September, Standard Issue turns 10. That's right, a whole decade of Standard Issue. So we thought it would be nice to go back through some of our favourite interviews. It's very hard to choose, it's a bit like children. Fortunately, I only have one of those, so no awkward conversations there. It was very hard to choose, but I have whittled it down to 3. This one was originally recorded in May 2022 with author and fellow Essex Girl Sarah Perry, around the time that her novel The Essex Serpent was about to air as an adaptation for Apple TV, starring Claire Danes no less. I mean, Claire Danes, does it get any better than that? I love Sarah's writing so much, and she is just such a joy to chat to about all manner of things. In this interview, we talked about that adaptation and what it is like to have a Hollywood star playing one of your characters. We talked about the fetishization of women's trauma and about being an Essex girl, and in particular, the appropriation of Boudica by Essex girls. Did you know that she burnt some shit down in Colchester? You do now. And actually, I'm wearing her around my neck. Not actually Boudica, obviously, a version of her. Sarah is brilliant. I just loved talking to her. I think she's just the most amazing writer. She's so interesting and smart and funny, and I had an absolute ball talking to her, so I hope you enjoy this interview too. I am delighted to say that I am joined on the Zoom by the author, Sarah Perry. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, hi.
Thank you very much for joining me. Basically, you're here today to, well, I'm going to ask you about a variety of different things, but the hook, which I didn't really need because, as I have already shamefully told you, I'm a big fan of your writing. Your book, The Essex Serpent, has been adapted for a new Apple TV series which starts on May the 13th. So I guess I wanted to ask you first of all, obviously the Essex Serpent wasn't your first novel, it was your second, and I don't know, like your difficult second album, as it were. You'd already written and had published After Me Comes a Flood, which did very well, received good reviews. It's often sort of thought of like this, the second work by any kind of artist is a bit, the follow-up is always a bit tricky, isn't it? So could you ever have anticipated how successful it would be?
No, absolutely not. I didn't even daydream about it. I think I'm quite hard on myself and on my ambitions, and I very rarely entertain daydreams that seem to me to be unreasonable, because that's the way you get disappointed. So I keep my ambitions really modest and focus much more on what I think of the art that I've made rather than how it's received. And After Me Comes the Flood, as I've spoken about this before, and I worry that it sounds resentful in some way, and it doesn't at all. I feel all gratitude, but I had a very difficult entry into publishing with many rejections and very long delays before publication, and my expectations were low anyway, and then crushed further. And I had this very strong sense of myself as being a bit odd. And my books as being a bit odd. I'm very preoccupied with ideas of goodness and sin and ethics and varieties of love and intimacy, and my prose style is a bit the product of my slightly 19th century upbringing, and at no point did I think that I would sell hundreds of thousands of copies. And then the reception to After Me Comes the Flood was amazing, especially after all the rejection, and I think that just put the wind in my sails slightly, and I thought, well, I'm a bit of an odd writer, but there's obviously people who enjoy my variety of oddness. So I wrote The Essex Serpent much more happily than I'd ever written my debut. But my expectations were a few more kind reviews and, being able to keep on paying the council tax and the rent. And so 2016 was just staggering to me to find that it had the reception that it did. And all word of mouth, none of it sort of cultivated via massive marketing campaigns or anything. It was, in fact, I went to the premiere of The Essex Serpent on TV, and I was with my wonderful team. So I was with my agent, my publisher, and my publicist. And we just sat there in a state of shock saying, do you remember handing out proofs of the Essex Serpent in early 2016? And we had hot cross buns and little tiny fluffy Easter chicks. And all of us and lots of the staff at Serpent's Tail just went into all our local bookshops. We would say, hello, my name's Sarah Perry, P-E-R-R-Y, and I've written a book called The Essex Serpent. The Essex. Would you like a proof? Like, if you have a beginning like that, which is all very sort of quite low key, but a very dedicated team, you don't expect to wake up 6 months later and find it's on a billboard in Victoria Coach Station. So, yeah, I think I'm a good lesson in keeping your expectations low so that you spend your whole life being amazed.
But do you think that kind of freed you in a way to write the book that you wanted to write?
Absolutely, and that's one of the benefits of having the agent and the publisher that I do, which is that I've never been cultivated to somebody who has to pursue a brand in order to retain a market share or anything like that, which is, I have to say, an extremely reasonable way of pursuing a living as a writer. And I'm not somebody who thinks that writing is some sort of divine art, that should be divorced from commerce. That's kind of nonsense, but it just happens to be that I'm interested in lots of different ways of writing and different modes of writing, different subjects, and it suits me to be with a team who let me just rush off and do this and then do something completely different. And it is incredibly freeing. Yeah. Low expectations is extremely freeing. And the aftermath of the Essex Serpent was probably more difficult than the lead up to it in that respect.
As I said at the top, it's been adapted for Apple TV for a 6-part series, which I've watched the first part of on a preview service, and it's very good, and it's got a big cast in it, which I'm going to come back to in a minute. How involved were you in the adaptation? Did you have any involvement in it? I saw on your Instagram that you had a role as an extra in one of the scenes, which is brilliant. But did you have any other sort of input?
There's so many different ways that a writer can be involved. I know Sarah Collins has adapted her novel and has been very involved and has worked very hard on it. And Naomi Alderman's been very involved in the adaptation of The Power. And I don't have the work ethic to become a screenwriter as well as everything else. I felt really strongly that I wanted to just hand it over because I'm a novelist and I don't really care about anything else. I mean, I really don't, like including my partner and family. I only really care about writing novels. And I knew that if I was involved in the adaptation, then that would really hamper my ability to work on the thing that really matters. And I wasn't sure really how much I could contribute because I'm not a screenwriter. But I was really lucky because I had my first meeting with Seesaw, which was the production company that optioned it. I went in and Jamie Lawrenson, who's the kind of head producer, he said, what's your main concern or main need for this? And I said, just please don't turn it into a cheap Victorian romance. This is a Gothic novel about faith and superstition and fear and intimacy, and it has real women as they actually were in the 19th century, not as we like to think of them. As long as you do that, then take it, God bless, and I won't interfere. And he just nodded in this very sober way, and he said, that's what we want to do. And I just believed him, absolutely, and left the office with this completely, this is probably bonkers, but this very assured sense, almost supernaturally assured sense that it was in the right hands. And actually what happened was I've just been staggered by how much they've involved me. So all along they would, I'd have a meeting with amazing Clio Bernard, and she'd produced a folder of images that she wanted to draw on, and they were all kind of Gothic Essex and Gothic kind of fishermen and scenes of London, Victorian London, that had grit and grain rather than kind of our perception of it as this kind of Dickensian theme park. And then I was shown the scripts and I was really happy with those, and all along I was involved much more than I expected to be, and they would kind of check that things were all right, and I would sort of look over my shoulder thinking, like, is someone more important than me in the room? I don't get why you're all looking at me. And then I'm like, yeah, I wrote the novel, okay. And so I was intending to be completely hands-off and was very hands-off, and then every now and then they would show me where they were, and I would just say, it's great, carry on, thank you. But my main way of dealing with it was to was to let them take the option and then just forget about it completely, just put it out of my mind. Because, of course, it's 6 years ago that they optioned it. So it's
wow.
a very long...
That is a long process,
really
then.
long process. Yeah. And the pandemic didn't help, of course.
No, I forget about that. I forget about the 2 years of nothing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about the cast. I wanted to ask you specifically about Claire Danes, who plays Cora in the TV adaptation. And, of course, she's a huge star. Like many other people of my generation, I first met, in inverted commas, Claire Danes in My So-Called Life, which was like quite a seminal programme of my youth. And I think you're about the same age as me. I know that you had quite a strict religious upbringing. So I wondered, did you ever watch that as a teenager? Have you ever seen it?
I never saw it. We didn't have a TV, and I've never seen it. But I have seen, obviously, because I'm not an animal, Romeo and Juliet about 3 times, and most of Homeland. And so it's really interesting because a lot of people ask me if Claire looks like I imagined Cora to look. And in the book, I describe Cora as being sort of tall and broad-hipped and kind of slightly untidy and very compellingly attractive when she sort of chooses to be. And Claire is a fairy of a woman with extraordinary poise and luminosity. And she doesn't really look like Cora's described. But the thing is, when I write my characters, I'm inside them. So although I obviously describe them because the reader has to see them, it's always their feelings and their emotions and their interiority that I think about most of all. And when I travelled down to set and saw Claire play Cora for the first time, all I saw was a woman in her late 30s, full of a joy for life that she can't really keep a lid on, clever and earnest, and full of love that she doesn't really know what to do with, and sort of a bit boyish, but also occasionally very grand and very beautiful. And it was just Cora. And that's the miracle of having an actor like Claire, who is absolutely at the top of her game, and I guess has been for years. And she just inhabits this person, and all things like hair colour or height are absolutely peripheral to mannerism and spirit. And you know, I've never seen acting up close, never visited a set before, and to see someone, I mean, she might as well have just taken flight. You know, it was just extraordinary. So I'm completely delighted by that. Yeah.
What is it like to have someone like Claire Danes bring this person that you've written, who I presume, you know, if she's a very rounded, you know, she's a very human character, and I will come on to her in a minute, but, you know, I presume you must in some ways love Cora like you must love all of your characters, right?
It's a really interesting question, and I worry that I'm some sort of psychopath lacking in empathy. I do think about them; they are real to me, but I'm also very, very clear that I made them up. You know,
yeah.
And my characters exist as a means of conveying ideas first and foremost. So I didn't conceive of the book initially because I thought of this wonderful woman and wondered what to do with her. The book was supposed to be about the conflict between faith and superstition and an examination of varieties of love. And then I constructed the characters as a way of examining those things. And so that sounds really hard-headed, and obviously it didn't stay that way because you live with them for a bit and then they do start to seem quite real. But I'm pretty ruthlessly unsentimental about the book and about the characters. I wrote it a long time ago, and I'm always very wary of resting on laurels and sort of looking wistfully back to a moment of professional success and not kind of moving on from it. So I've kept a lid on my affection for them all as a means of making sure that I press ahead. That being said, I've seen the whole series, all 6 hours of it. I was shown it in a little cinema in London. It got to the end, and I was so profoundly moved that I had to put my coat over my head so I could cry in peace, because the director and the producer and some of the crew were like around me, and I just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. So I think Claire and Tom as well, Tom Hiddleston, they did something to the characters that they performed some form of witchcraft that chipped through this like block of ice in my heart that like makes me want to be unsentimental, be intellectual about it, be hard, be ambitious. They chipped through all of that and they went straight through to the fact that I love these people, and I just howled. So I think, to answer your question in a slightly less roundabout way, what it did was permit me access to a degree of sentimentality and feeling that I didn't know I had, and that I'd prevented myself from having.
Well, that's a very good answer, and an unexpected one, to be honest. I wanted to ask you a little bit about Cora, the central character, because she's a very interesting character, and as you say, you've not written these characters in a sentimental way. They're plot devices, basically. But I think one of the things that's really interesting about her, and I think is still quite rare to see, is that Cora is, at the beginning of the book, her husband has just died, and we sort of learn in a more subtle way, I guess, but it is very clear that she's been a victim of domestic abuse.
Yeah.
But she is also a very three-dimensional character, which I think is still quite rare in representations of abuse. She has been abused, but she's funny, she's interesting, she's clever, she's feisty. Was that a deliberate thing?
It's a really interesting question. And actually, it's tied up a lot with my presentation of Victorian women. So I think that you're dead right, and that where presentations of women who have been abused or traumatised are concerned, they don't tend to be massively three-dimensional. And I think it's because people want to know about the trauma and they like to conceive of women as being victims. And this is a really sensitive, subtle subject, and I have to speak very carefully at risk of appearing to be quite brutal about these things in a way that I don't intend. But women are not the sum total of their oppression and their trauma. Mm-hmm. And I also, controversially, don't think it helps the cause of feminism in any way to foreground female frailty, female suffering, and female trauma in the way that we have tended to do. I think that fiction is easy to read and pleasurable to read in a base way when it salivates over the suffering of women. And I don't like it. I think it's a spurious pleasure, a bit lowest common denominator. But how did she suffer? Did it hurt? Did he cut her? Did she weep? Is she really traumatised? And this is not something I recognise from the women I know, including the women who have endured trauma. I had a wonderful conversation with the novelist Sarah Hall, who's a good friend of mine, and we talked about female resilience and about how actually it should be possible to examine domestic abuse and the patriarchy and so on through the filter not of female trauma but of female resilience. So the trauma is implicit in the depiction, but it's about the resilience through various means. So it was really important to me that what she endured at the hands of her husband was a constituent part of her character and not the defining characteristic. And I think the reason this matters is that if we dwell so heavily on the suffering of women, we end up accepting less as our due. Because as long as we're not being abused and then we're in a relatively stable relationship, in some way, it suggests almost that we should be grateful for that. But actually, if we see it as being the absolute aberration that it is, and women as the resilient, not all women are resilient because they're human beings and there's no reason why they should be, but if we see women as having enormous capacities of self-help, helping others, resilience, fortitude, then actually what happens is oppression of various kinds seems worse, not better. Does that make any kind of bizarre circular sense?
Yes, yeah, it does. I mean, the listener can't see me, but I have been nodding nodding throughout. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, and I agree that it's kind of like this misery porn, isn't it, almost, that sort of permeates everything. This we must have the, and I know a lot of women who we've spoken to on the podcast about TV particularly, and sort of detective programs and things like that, where you see these kind of splayed naked dead women all the time, and it's just that I'm just bored of it. And what is what point are we trying to make? Because it starts to look a bit like titillation, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And I also think Cora you didn't do it because you are an astute and intelligent woman, but Cora is repeatedly described as being a very modern heroine, which just makes you want to like kick a hole in a Land Rover. She's not modern, she's Victorian, and Victorian women were quite modern, you know. And I was taken to task by some dreadful little man in a newspaper for writing a version of the 19th century that he said struck him as being a fantasy world. But you know, by the time the novel is set, women had been able to train in medical school for 20 years, and they'd been able to go to Oxford and Cambridge for 20 years. By the time the novel was set, women were working in mathematics, engineering, nuclear science, you know, with Marie Curie. They were working, you know, in social justice. They were in politics. There's an idea that women haven't been able to vote in any form of political election until 1918, but there are poll books showing women, including poor women and beggar women, voting in local political elections in the 1850s.
Wow.
And the more we think of Victorian women as not allowed out without a chaperone and, you know, just sitting patiently at home hanging their handkerchiefs and waiting for their husband to come up and shout at them before they give birth to their ninth baby, you know, the more we think that that's what life was like until the modern woman hatched out of an egg in 1918 and became suffragettes. Firstly, it's so ahistorical as to be visible, and secondly, it means that our hard-won rights are so recent that we just have to be grateful with what we've got. Whereas if you realise that, you know, this amazing poll book, I think from Leicestershire from the 1850s, shows a woman who owned a grocery shop, business owner, ran a grocery shop, voting in the local political elections, the more you realise how absurd it is that we haven't leapt forward in 170 years to quite the extent that woman might have expected. So, you know, there's a lot of work to be done about reconstituting the idea of the Victorian women. And there's people like Hallie Rubinold, who wrote the biography of Jack the Ripper, and Fern Riddell. So it's all part of the same thing. I'm just never going to write a woman who is defined by suffering. Just not going to do it, because I've never met one. So there you go.
You kind of led neatly onto my next question, which I'd heard an interview that you gave a few years ago about the Essex Serpent, and you talked about how people see the kind of a Victorian novel, but at the same time, as you've just said, it has very contemporary themes, etc., etc. And you'd said in the interview that you wanted to show how modern the 19th century actually was. Why was it so important for you to do that? Was it important from a feminist perspective for you to do that, or was it?
No, it's sheer mischief. It's really like winding people up. I mean, I should say I'm a passionate, as you can tell, feminist, but I also don't think about it that much because I don't think about my gender very much, and I certainly don't think of myself as a woman writer. So I don't tend to lead with women. Sorry, or like my own, I guess, identity as a woman, which is entirely peripheral to me. You know, it doesn't really mean very much to me. It hasn't, I feel, through a series of strokes of luck and intersections of privilege and identity, it hasn't really affected me very much. The main thing actually is just, sheer mischief. I like play and I like surprise, and I just thought it would be really good fun to write a 19th century novel that really wound people up with its presentation of the 19th century. And every now and then somebody comes to one of my events and they stand up and they say, I just was expecting a Victorian novel, and, you know, 100 pages in, I thought to myself, this could have been set today, and they're really angry. And I said, thank you so much. Thank you for understanding my work. Because, you know, this is the 1890s. If you woke up and it was a cold day, you could warm yourself by the radiator, making toast in your toaster, and put Robinson's marmalade on it, and then take the tube to work at the Prudential Insurance Company. And if you had toothache, you could get it taken out with anaesthetic, and then you could come home and cheer yourself up with some Bourneville hot chocolate. You know, of course, there's an enormous number of things about the 19th century that are so remote to us as to be virtually alien, but that's been repeatedly done. And I just thought it would be a laugh to do something different. And then the more I looked into it, the more I, especially looking at women and the way women are presented and the way they were. If you just look at diaries, letters, correspondence, you realise that, you know, the vision of women in the Victorian age that we have is just, it's so off-beam. It would be like a historian in 100 years' time reading Jilly Cooper novels to get a handle on the lives of ordinary women in the UK. It would be, you know, I'm a huge fan of Jilly Cooper. It would be massively good fun, and it would be very educational about a certain type of woman, but it wouldn't be rigorous as a sort of historical review.
Okay, so I want to move on to a sort of slightly different, well, this is still a historical context question, I guess. So I should probably disclose, I am, like yourself, an Essex girl. I am speaking to you live from Harwich, would you believe?
I could hear your accent and I thought, she's from Essex, isn't
really?
she? just, yeah.
Honestly, very proud of that, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. You've written about it in the Essex Serpent. Obviously, it is set in Essex, and the bit before they go off to Old Winter is they're in Colchester, a place that I know very well, obviously having grown up in Harwich. It made me laugh reading the book, and it's like, oh, Colchester, what's she doing going to Colchester? You know, whatever. Was that like a contemporary joke, or is that how people felt about Essex back in the day?
It's kind of both. Dickens hated Essex. He went to Chelmsford, which is where I'm from. And I wish I could remember his exact phrase, but he was terribly rude about Chelmsford. He really was. But mostly, my book, I wrote a short book called Essex Girls that talks about this a bit, but like mostly it's a really modern phenomenon, and it's kind of from the 70s, 80s and 90s, and it is tied up with the way women are presented, and it's tied up with this really interesting place that Essex has, which is that it's sort of everything and nothing. So it's become subsumed into London, and where it's become subsumed into London, it's lost some of its extraordinary identity. And yet out on the fringes, on the margins of Essex, it's really weird, but people don't ever get to the weird bit. They just go out on the underground to like the furthest reaches of the underground line, and they can't see that it's anything different. And then there's a really interesting kind of political thing where Essex became a bit of a political football, because it was largely working class, but they all voted Tory. So they were kind of class traitors, because, you know, there were builders that were doing really well out of Thatcher. There were lots of people in the trades. There were women and boys going up to the city, you know, coming out of Fenchurch Street from Basildon and sort of entering what had been a kind of quite posh preserve with their Essex accents, and so they became really despised. So I know that Dickens wasn't a fan, but it was mostly a kind of contemporary joke, that everybody in the Essex Serpent is so contemptuous of Essex.
I mean, I actually came to your writing through Essex Girls. I guess it's an essay? Would you call it an essay? A long essay?
Yeah.
So that's how I sort of came to know of your writing. I saw something posted about it on the brilliant Sadie Hasler, also an Essex girl, who we chat to on the podcast from time to time, something about it on her Instagram feed, and I was like, oh, I need to read that, and you know, obviously I loved it. This sort of part of the world, it's not a very glamorous part of the world. We've got witches, we've got Boudica, she's technically from Norfolk, but you know, whatever.
I appropriated her.
Yeah, me too. I've definitely appropriated her. We got You're from Harwich, which I am. We've got Heidi High, Bagpuss as well. But Essex Girls is hilarious and brilliant, and you know, I think it's such a wanky thing to say. I'm sorry, but important. And I'm enormously proud to be an Essex girl, and I imagine you must be too, to have written about it in such a way. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I am now, but I wasn't. And I've spoken to a lot of people, including girls that I went to school with in Chelmsford, and spoken to them about how they feel about it. And a lot of us lied. We would say things like, I'm from just outside London. Or when, you know, a lot of us moved immediately to London, and we would say, I'm from London, rather than saying, you know, I'm originally from Essex. Because everywhere you went, which in my case wasn't very far, because, you know, we didn't travel or have foreign holidays or anything, but, you know, there'd be jokes about being an Essex girl.
Yeah.
And it really rankled. And that my task with writing Essex Girls actually was to tutor myself out of snobbery and misogyny, because I realised I was rejecting the idea of being an Essex girl because I didn't want to be thought to be loud and vulgar and sexually promiscuous. And then I woke up one day in my 30s and thought, hang on a second, what's wrong with any of those things? And realised that, you know, what does being loud mean? It means saying your piece, being heard in public, in the public sphere, a fantastic quality, essential for any woman that's going to change the world in any way at all. You know, what does vulgarity mean? It means dressing and presenting yourself in a way that's unpalatable to the ruling classes. Well, good. So, and, you know, it's, you know, nobody should hold a view on a woman for the number of sexual partners that she's had. So that book was a way of me kind of apologising for ever having tried to distance myself from the concept of the Essex girl, and instead kind of saying that those are all fantastic qualities and may we all inhabit them more.
Well, because this part of Essex is, you know, it is really rich in history. As I said, Boudica, or I like to call her Boadicea actually, but I know that's technically inaccurate, which is, you know, Matthew Hopkins, all of that sort of stuff. The English Civil War. Colchester played a very important role in the English Civil War. There's lots of nursery rhymes come from Colchester, like...
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. What's the one? Humpty Dumpty is actually about a cannon.
Is that from Colchester?
Yeah, it's about a royalist cannon that got shot down from St Botolph's Church.
Amazing.
Yeah, I think Twinkle Twinkle Little Star is also from Colchester, but I don't know the story behind that. Someone told me that on a tour once for my A-level history class. So I guess for, you know, if you're writing pieces set in a historical context, that's like quite a nice, you know, wealth to draw on.
I think I was talking to either an American reader or my American publisher, definitely in the States.
Oh my God, the Mayflower, the Pilgrim Fathers, sorry, like all of that stuff
absolutely.
as well,
Yeah. And I was trying to explain how, like, if you've got a back garden in Essex and you dig, then you're digging down through scenes of history, because you've got, like, if it's in the right place of Essex, then the top part could well have, like, remnants of Blitz damage. And you go down a bit further and you're turning up Victorian stuff. And then you might start turning up Anglo-Saxon things. You know, there's a reason why The Detectorists is set in Essex, because the soil is full of, you know, Saxon gold. And then you keep going down further and you find bits of Roman pottery. And that's, you know, just pick a field in Essex. It's the history of the nation is encased in the soil. And I find that so exciting as a kind of microcosm of what our nation is, which is that there's no such thing as like the indigenous people of the UK or people who have a right to live here. It's, you know, what Jeremy Paxman called a mongrel race. You know, Vikings, Normans, Romans, Saxons, the whole lot. And Essex, because of where it's located, had so much of that going on and a constant kind of turnover of cultures. And I find that really exciting. And that's something that I think is something to be proud of, rather than like a slightly horrifying kind of blood and soil notion of Englishness, where you sort of think that everything's been the same for hundreds of years. We're from somewhere that shows how everything kept changing. And it will keep changing. And that's exciting. And that's like, as a culture should be.
So in the Essex Serpent, Cora heads off to Colchester and then she hears about the serpent and she goes out to the fictional town of Aldwinter, which we know is near Colchester, to go and find this serpent, in inverted commas. And I wondered if you could tell me, where is Aldwinter? Is it based on a specific place, or is that like secret information?
Having claimed to have a block of ice in my heart where my book's concerned, do you know, I was writing something about 3 years ago. I was writing something about the Essex Serpent, and I googled Aldwinter to check where it was, and then I got halfway through and you made it up. Right, so the Essex coast used to extend kind of further, and it's had a lot of coastal erosion and loads of sea defences. And I'm not 100% clear, and also the North Sea flood in 1952 kind of changed the coastline. I've taken liberties with whether or not there's like an extant village that is now gone, but I have in mind out right by Mersey Island, but not actually over the causeway, the Morden area, St Osyth, all of that around the Blackwater estuary. There are all of these places that are so familiar to me from my childhood because I'm an Essex girl, so I'd be visiting them all the time. And I chose to invent a village because then I could just be free. And I actually wrote the book in real time. So I began writing, it starts in January, I think, and I began writing it in January. And I don't drive, so my parents and my husband would be dragooned into constantly driving me down to the Essex coast in each of the months of the year so that I could look at the wildlife and I could look at what the weather was doing and I could look at what the hedgerows were doing. And we went to Mersey Island a lot. We went to a couple of nature reserves, the names of which I can't remember. Rainham Marshes, I think we went to, Malden, St Osyth, all of those places. And then I smooshed them together to make Aldwinter.
And because I guess if it's Aldwinter, then you don't have to actually say Mersey Island is a bit weird.
Yes, really odd, yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
And I wanted to ask you about something else, which is on a completely different subject. But the other thing that we have in common, Sarah, is that I also have the terrifyingly named, but not actually that terrifying autoimmune condition, Graves' disease. Which
do you really?
Yeah, I do.
Oh wow! Oh God! Okay.
Yeah.
I very rarely meet anyone with it, which is odd because it's not that rare. You're the only the second person I've spoken to who has it.
I saw something on your Instagram feed where you described something, and I was like, "Oh, that sounds like Graves." So I googled Sarah Perry Graves, and it transpired you'd written this article about it.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you about that because I saw, from some of the articles you've read, it sounded like it had quite a profound effect on you. I saw an interview where you said that you wouldn't have been able to write the Essex Serpent if you'd had the experience before you'd written it.
One of the reasons I found the adaptation of the Essex Serpent really difficult was because it represents time before I really suffered. So it represents kind of my youth in a way that is amazing, but also quite melancholy. So I was already ill when it was published, but we didn't know what was wrong.
Yeah.
And for a long time, the symptoms looked like anxiety. Because they do, if you have Graves' disease, your thyroid dumps loads of, you end up with loads of stuff dumped in your bloodstream, like cortisol and all sorts. So, you have a racing heart and you're sweating and you feel sick and you keep going to the toilet and you can't sleep and you've got a headache. All of this kind of stuff, it looks like anxiety. So if you have a book that's suddenly gone insane and you're used to your quiet little life in Norwich and suddenly you're being, all over the place, that's kind of a thing. And so people felt it might be anxiety. And then I was diagnosed with it, and then it was like having a chip on the windscreen of a car and then the car hitting a speed bump and everything shattering. So one of the massive things that happens with Graves' disease is you lose an enormous amount of weight, if it's untreated for a while. And then you're medicated and then you gain it. And I lost some weight and then gained a large amount of weight. And also Graves' disease wastes your bones and muscles, so you become very, very weak if you have it to the extent that I did. So I was somebody who had a lot of bone loss, muscle wastage, weight changes, weakness, and it ended up with me rupturing a disc in my spine so severely I had partial paralysis of the leg and had to have emergency spinal surgery and endured literally suicidal pain. I would have killed myself if I could have done. And it's not uncommon for people to attempt suicide when they've had the kind of pain that I have. And then I had a very long road of recovery back from all of that, and it took my joy. I can't. There's no sense kind of putting it another way. My youth ended and my optimism ended, because once you've endured that degree of pain, then you can't ever go back to not knowing that. And I was eventually diagnosed with PTSD of the same kind that torture victims are diagnosed with, and had a lot of therapy and a lot of treatment for that. And I'm changed forever, and I'll never be the same. And so the best way of describing it is, the woman that wrote the Essex Serpent is dead. And so I watch it on TV and talk about it, and it's wonderful because it represents this time of kind of optimism and youth and innocence, this kind of prelapsarian version of myself. And I'm glad she existed, which doesn't exist now, which is why my next book was really dark. So, and I feel, I've been very lucky. I've recovered brilliantly. I'm a picture of health and strength. I'm so strong, I can pick up grown men and throw them across the room should I need to. But mentally, there's something happened that I'm past, but that I always kind of carry with me. So that's kind of what I meant. I couldn't have written it. I couldn't write it now because I'm not as bonny as I was. Sounds really sad. Sorry, it's really depressing.
Well, I don't think we need to feel too sad. You've just had your very, very, very successful book made into a TV programme starring Claire Danes. So I think you're doing all right. Right?
I'm doing all right. And it was really nice, actually. Clio Bernard, the director, is this extraordinary woman. And I went down on set during the pandemic, when we really weren't supposed to be doing anything. Everyone was masked up and it was loads of COVID tests. It's incredibly secure. And we weren't allowed to touch each other. So we were standing 2 meters apart. And I looked at it all and I was really emotional. And I said, this is really important. This is incredibly healing because I've been through some stuff, and what you're doing is reminding me of this joy. And I started crying, and then Clio started to get really tearful, and we couldn't embrace, and I'm a really big hugger, and I was like, oh God, and we were just all touching elbows on a field in Mersey Island, in March 2021. And that's one of the reasons I feel really emotional about it, is that it did, it brought it all back, and it was this kind of healing circuit that things orbit. I'd been in a bit of a dark place, and then I'd come orbiting back towards the light, and it's really amazing. Yeah, I'm really grateful from that point of view.
I believe you are working on something at the moment. What's next for you? What can you tell us about what you're up to?
I have just finished the draft of a book that took me 5 years to write, which is partly the pandemic, but partly, I don't know how much I'm allowed to say about it. I'll say it's set in Essex. There you go. I've written another book set in Essex. And I've just, because I like to work, I've just started researching the next one, which might have a medieval element in it. I think I'm going to return to historical fiction and have a look at another period of history. So I feel really lucky. I just sit in my study making up stuff. What a life,
Sarah, where can we follow you? I mean, I know where I do follow you, but where can we follow you on any kind of social media to keep up to date with what you're doing? And I do follow you on Instagram, and you are very entertaining, and I enjoy your posts very much. Just to fangirl you again.
Oh, that's nice to hear. I'm only on Instagram, and I think it's Sarah Grace Perry, or one word, or is it Sarah_Grace_Perry?
I think it's Sarah Grace Perry, but I'm not that creepy that I could actually tell.
You'll find me. I'm the only Sarah Grace Perry there, so yeah, you'll find me. And it's mostly whippets and books and clothes and the moon, if that interests people.
Is there anything else in life? Sarah, thank you so much for chatting to me. It has been an absolute joy.
Thank you. I enjoyed it enormously. It was really great. Cheers.